Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. I'm joined today by my colleague Ari Van Berkel, Chief Product Officer at Lux Research. And my name is Naveen Krishnamurthy. I lead our work with Chief Technology and Innovation Officers across our clients as they strategize and execute toward the products and services of tomorrow. And today, our discussion is pertinent. This webinar is titled Strategizing for 2026 and Beyond, Positioning and Goal Setting for Innovation Teams. Throughout this webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check your internet connection. Now let's jump into the presentation. Ari, why don't you kick us off?
Yes, thank you, Naveen, and thank you for joining us in this webinar. So we have a busy schedule today. We're going to first look at how to strategize, also for near-term wins. So we'll talk about balancing long and near-term objectives, and then we'll get a bit more into positioning and goal setting itself. And finally, we talk about how to set priorities and how to set targets. So targets are different from goals. Targets tell you if you're on your way to reaching your goal. But first things first, strategizing. Why do we talk about strategizing to begin with? Well, let's take a look at this picture here. This is the R&D intensity. We looked at R&D intensity of a lot of different companies, and we split them up in industrials, chemicals, and CPG. And the reason we did this was because we were curious if there was a trend, and there was a trend. So that's interesting. So you can see for chemicals and CPG, the trend is down. R&D intensity is going down. And as you can see, we plotted it here as an index, but you should imagine it's going down from about 3% to nowadays about between 1.5 and 2%. For industrials, on the other hand, R&D intensity is going up. They're investing more in R&D as a share of, as a part of their revenue. So what's going on? How do we interpret this, and what does it have to do with strategizing? Well, at first glance, it looks like chemicals and CPG are innovating less. Or alternatively, they have become really efficient at innovation. Now let's discard that latter thing, right? They haven't become really efficient at innovation. They're okay, but not that much more efficient. So are they innovating less? Well, not really. What they are doing is they're picking and choosing which part of their product portfolio to innovate. So that's one. What about industrials? Well, industrials don't have that luxury. They make equipment and they need to innovate every piece of equipment, and their innovation, their product cycles are getting faster. So the product cycles getting faster means you need to innovate faster as well. Where you had maybe 6 years to produce a new version of your equipment, now you probably have like 3 or 4 years. And that means that they necessarily have to innovate more. In both cases, you have to make good choices. You have to be really vigilant. So for chemicals and CPG, you have to make choices where in your product portfolio you need to focus your innovation effort. Because if you spread it across everything, you're either very expensive or you don't make a lot of momentum. You're not very fast in your innovation, and all of your innovations are too slow compared to your competition. If you're industrials, you need to make the right choices because you only have 4 years to make the next version of your products. And you need to spend those 4 years well focusing on precisely the right things. So you need a strategy. why do you need a strategy? And by the way, what is a strategy? Well, there's many different definitions of strategy. And so I could pick and choose. If you look at all the different English dictionaries, you will find that they all differ a little bit about what a strategy is, which is great. It means I could pick the one that suits me, and I did. I picked the one from Cambridge. It also means that strategy is a bit of an elusive concept still. Now, I like the Cambridge definition because it's very clear, right? It is about a plan. A strategy is a plan containing actions, and it's timed. It has a time aspect to it, and the reason for the existence of the plan is to change your position and to achieve certain goals. So those are two elements, two reasons to have a strategy. You want to achieve certain goals. If you're an industrial company, you want to innovate for your next version of all of your products. If you're a chemical company, you want to improve part of your product portfolio. So you want to achieve something, but you also want to change your position. After the execution of your strategy and after you've achieved everything, you should be in a position to do something else, to do something different from what you did before. So when creating a strategy, you have to think about your timing, you have to think about positioning, you have to define your goals, you have to plan, and plan with flexibility because things will happen. You have to define your actions, and then you have to evaluate and repeat the whole thing over again. And you can put that in a cycle, and the cycle looks like this. Now, in this cycle, you go from positioning to setting goals, to making your plan, to creating and actioning, right, executing on your actions, and to reviewing how you did. And then you go again to positioning, etc. And for each of those, we at Lux have defined methods. So if you want to turn your goals into a plan, we tend to use road mapping. And we just had a webinar about road mapping about a month ago. If you want to evaluate if your actions have worked, you need to design a balanced scorecard. If you want to determine your positioning, what we prefer to use is weak signals. As you look at this schedule, you can also see that it tries to balance the why and the what of innovation. So the top part is about why do you innovate? Maybe because you were disappointed about your review, or maybe your review showed that you were exceptionally good at something. And then after you've determined the why, only then you go on to determine what. What are you going to do? What technology should you be investing in? At the same time, it's also trying to balance planning and acting. Right? Planning and acting should be two separate activities. Of course, they're connected. That's why there's this cycle. But try to plan your actions and then act. So today, we are not going to talk about the entire cycle. If you've seen probably that the title of this webinar said part 1. There will be a part 2. Part 2 will be talking about the organizational design and the balanced scorecard. Today, we are going to discuss positioning. We are going to discuss how you can use weak signals to define your positioning, which means that this allows you to prioritize. Again, if you're CPG or chemicals, prioritize where on your portfolio you want to innovate with urgency, with critical mass. And for if you're an industrial, you want to change your positioning in terms of what you are going to innovate about your products. Are you going to make them connected? Are you going to make them running on batteries as opposed to plugged in? Are you going to make them fully automatic using AI? What choices are you making for this round of innovation of your product? And weak signals will help you choose the right position. So let's dive in. What is weak signals? When we say weak signals, of course, and my colleague Naveen will talk about the weak signals and signals in general in a moment. But when we say weak signals at Lux, we are talking about a very specific methodology, which consists of 3 steps. The first step is to imagine. So in this example that we're showing here, we're imagining that CO2 could be the raw material of the future. That's not unheard of. I think there's several, you won't be hard pressed to find people who will have that kind of vision of the future. Now, how do you know if that's just your imagination or if that's something that you can act on? Well, you start to listen. Listening means you start to look for weak signals. And we'll talk a little bit about what a signal is and what a weak signal is later on. In this case, Nordic Electrofuel is planning to open its first CO2-based sustainable aviation fuel plant in 2027. That is a good weak signal because it means there's something real going on, there's money being spent, there's something at stake. It's also still a weak signal. It's not like this plant is going to provide the entire aviation industry for the next 10 years or something. Once you find those weak signals and you trust them, then you can go and amplify and say, okay, so wait a minute, what if CO2, what if this becomes the norm? CO2 is the feedstock of choice. What does it mean? Well, it means that CO2 becomes the carbon ore. It means that the plastics industry will look a lot like the steel industry, where it's more beneficial to recycle steel than to create steel completely fresh from iron ore, of course. So that will help you imagine what the future looks like. And then, of course, once you've done that, you need to define your position within that future. And that's what we'll be talking about in the rest of this webinar. So, positioning and goal setting. So, you've used weak signals. You have a vision of the future that you think is trustworthy. And we'll talk about how trustworthy and all that in a moment. And based on that vision, you have to choose your position. Now, my colleague, Naveen Krishnamurthy, has looked at one of the potential weak signals that we think are interesting. And he will show you how going from that one weak signal, you can go to a wide variety of positioning for different industries. So Naveen, why don't you take us through your case?
Thank you, Ari. I think your brief hint about aviation should be a weak signal for the audience for a few next minutes of discussion about weak signals using an example. So, the term weak signals animates many conversations that we have with innovation leaders. For example, 10 years ago, using weak signals, could a European oil and gas company have predicted the supply-demand imbalance in the US shale plays that led to the collapse of oil prices and declining margins for years to come? Could they have done that? Or 5 years ago, could a global leader in alcoholic beverages have interpreted the decline in consumption of breakfast cereal among young consumers in the US and sensed that something was amiss in how young consumers were relating to food and beverage on taste, nutrition, and wellness? And late last year, how many of you knew that the prospect of punitive trade barriers was more than just an election campaign promise? We're unable to do these things routinely because, unlike waiting for things to show up as clean blips on a finely tuned radar screen, most of us, looking out into the landscape outside our own companies, are confronted with this. It's fuzzy, it's messy, it's noise. The kind of noise that emanates from the latest political developments, for example, when sometimes it seems the amplitude of noise and likely even the true signals within that noise reach crescendo levels. And so isolating signal from noise is a gap, even in many of the most extroverted innovation organizations. The kind of organizations that have their ears to the ground. They're talking to external stakeholders, continually monitoring competitors and so on. But before we get too far, what really is a weak signal? Again, a weak signal for us is an occurrence. It's real, it's not imagined. It passes by us often without us taking note, and its full import can only be perceived much later. And we often miss weak signals because of this. They're occurring over there when we're looking over here. So then what's a single weak signal good for if these signals are all around us? Well, a single weak signal may not amount to much, but at any given time, multiple weak signals are conjuring up a catalyst. That catalyst then has the potential to reshape prevailing trends, either changing their pace or their direction. Well, then, what is not a weak signal? Or more pointedly, how should we not use a signal? Here's the CEO of Chevron talking about how volatility in commodity prices on international commodity exchanges is not a signal that goes into their long-term investment decisions. Yeah, instead, long-term investment decisions are made considering long-term trends in supply, demand, technology, competition, and price. Appropriately so. Now let's see how weak signals are used in shaping strategy and actions. Let's take a look at a trend that everyone I think in this audience is likely part of. Google offers search result trends on a variety of topics. And so this divergence that you see in search volume for traveling solo versus traveling with kids, which started around 10 years ago, continues to widen today. So is it possible then that some industry out there has seen that crossover in searches that occurred around 2014, a weak signal, and is acting on it? Indeed. Well, United Airlines, for example, is now making available features targeted at solo travelers that make it easier for them to select seats, to get in and out of airports quickly, etc. Why the special treatment for solo travelers? Because solo travelers can bear higher ticket prices per seat than, say, a family traveling with kids that might decide to just take the train or drive instead of paying higher prices for the privilege of flying. In fact, it's these leisure travelers flying solo that want a better experience than economy provides, but that does not want to pay for business class, that is driving premiumization across the airline industry. In fact, during COVID, exploiting that big dip in passenger volume, Emirates, the Middle Eastern carrier, refreshed their cabin interiors to introduce premium economy seats for the very first time, while keeping business class and first class cabins virtually untouched. What else is happening? Your first time, on a commercial plane as a young person, all you probably wanted to do was stare outside the window and take in the view all the way from takeoff to landing. Over time, most of us have grown out of that fascination. These days, most of us find ourselves glued to the in-flight entertainment screen or to our own laptops and smartphones, especially as solo travelers. So now, advances in in-flight entertainment means you can have an immersive experience around you in your own seat. So who needs windows? What does that mean for air carriers? Could we add even more seats in the middle of the aircraft far from any windows? And that's the kind of thinking that is supporting entirely new types of aircraft design, like blended wing airplanes that Jet Zero plans to introduce. This geometry does not allow for many windows, but what it does do is deliver tremendous fuel savings, up to 45%, by Jet Zero's own accounts on a cross-Atlantic flight. Because, among other things, almost the entire aircraft acts like a single wing, generating lift as it goes, and with a relatively lower wetted area compared to conventional tube and wing designs of today. No wonder United Airlines has already signed conditional agreements to buy 200 Jet Zero aircraft, seating 200 to 250 passengers each, and begin test flights as early as 2027. So, a lot more seating in the middle, plenty of open space, just like the lounge in the now discontinued Boeing 747, for solo travelers to mingle with other solo travelers if they wish to. But it also has wider aisles and entry doorways for us efficient solo travelers to get around, fellow passengers with kids. All of this and more sounds wonderful. But if these aircraft are going to be built, what else needs to happen? The beauty of the conventional tube and wing aircraft design of today is because of its cylindrical cross-section, it is excellent at distributing cabin air pressure equally across that cross-section. But given their geometry, these blended wing aircraft will need entirely new materials. Think composites, not aluminum. And yes, new manufacturing techniques to fabricate those large panels of composites. Overall, some interesting opportunities, wouldn't you say, for transference from military to commercial, from automotive to aerospace, even from sports apparel to seat upholstery and many others. What else is occurring because of the rise of the solo traveler? In a different but related industry, Hilton, one of the largest hotel chains in the world, says 51% of millennials, that's those who are 29 to 44 years of age today, 51% of those folks are more likely to travel on their own for leisure. There's even a term for solo leisure travelers. They're called me-mooners, a riff clearly on the word honeymooners. And as it turns out, 25% of solo leisure travelers travel with pets. Why is that important? Imagine what that means for a pet food company. It's the opportunity to build single-serve snacks and meals for pets. For a hotel chain like Hilton, this could mean opportunities to offer pet daycare for travelers who may want to spend a few hours discovering their new environs on their own first, etc., etc. Now, clearly, not all of these strategies and actions across commercial aviation, hotels and hospitality, materials and manufacturing, not all of these are occurring purely because of that one weak signal in 2014 when interest in solo travel surpassed interest in travel with kids. But the point remains that in hindsight, that occurrence is an important through line in these developments that we've highlighted. And Ari, I think you may have an example that's even more exciting than dog food, don't you?
I don't know if it's more exciting than dog food. I guess that depends on your perspective. But let's see a concrete example of a company that looked at weak signals and acted on it, and see if we can trace it back to our weak signal methodology. So we're talking about DSM, who, as I'm sure most of you know, has gone through a tremendous journey, right? DSM stands for Dutch State Mines. So it originally was a coal mining company, and then started to make mostly commodity chemicals out of coal. And nowadays, DSM Firmenich is a food additives company. And by that, I don't mean to imply that you're eating coal nowadays. So they really completely went out of their original business and completely changed into something else. And one of the steps in that journey was their acquisition of a company called Just Brocades, which was a biotech company making gist, which is a Dutch word for yeast, and some yeast-derived products like alcohol and things like that. They acquired Just Brocades in 1998, and as you can see in our Lux Tech signal, that is just when white biotech started to show a lot of additional innovation potential. So they really caught the wave of white biotech. So how did they do that? How did they catch that wave? Because at the time, DSM was not a company that was paying, in a natural way, much attention to white biotech. They were a classical, hardcore thermocatalytic company. And the company they acquired, Just Brocades, was about 10 times smaller than DSM. Yet they acted on it, and also they put the new acquisition at the front of their activities. So one of the first things they did after the acquisition, or merger probably more likely, was to appoint the Chief Innovation Officer of DSM to be someone from the newly acquired company. So they consciously picked a Chief Innovation Officer who had a wide biotech background. Now, I wasn't there. So at the time, I was trying to write a PhD thesis. So I wasn't there, so I cannot tell you exactly what the considerations were, but we can take a look at what kind of weak signals, how could they have picked up on this? Right? And then you can see there were quite a few interesting weak signals. So you could imagine at the time, the human genomics project was really starting and delivering its first results. So there was a lot of talk about DNA, about maybe even possibly engineering DNA, which was quite an elusive dream at the time. So in the imagine stage of our weak signal methodology, you could see how there's a lot of things pointing at biotechnology becoming a really interesting area of science for engineers. At the same time, if you see that and you say, okay, well, so this whole biotech thing, we could make maybe catalysts using DNA and biology. Maybe we could even make factories like organisms that produce certain substances for us using our newly obtained understanding of DNA and biology. So let's imagine that. Can we listen? Can we see things that are already happening? Well, one of the things that you could see at the time was PerkinElmer's acquiring companies involved in DNA analysis, and the first DNA sequencers being developed and being actually sold to labs. Right. And then if you amplify and you fast forward about 15 years, you can see DSM building the world's largest biogas facility in India. And the idea of that was not so much to produce biogas as a company, but really to provide enzymes for optimizing the biogas production. And this basically was a demonstration plant for them to show how you could make large-scale biogas feasible by using the DSM enzymes at the time. So you can see how to make that imagine, listen, amplify sequence a real thing. Now, let's get back to our agenda and priorities and targets. And at the start, we talked about near-term wins as well. So we talked about positioning, which means that you're taking a long-term perspective when you devise your innovation strategy, but you also want to, of course, have near-term results. So how do we reconcile that? And that's what we're going to talk about right now in priorities and targets. How do you make this work? So how do you catch your own wave? Well, first, of course, you have to think, where is my wave? Just like DSM, who found a wave way outside of the current remit of the company, you have to make sure that you source whatever wave you're after way outside of the current remit of your company. Just like a materials company doesn't know that people like that there's more people booking plane tickets solo and what the consequences of that might be. But that same material company may want to invest in automated layup for their composite materials so that they can make the fuselage of the future. Except they need to know that they need to look at the solo traveling weak signal. So how do you get to that? How do you make those connections? You have to really source from various parts, and you have to make a conscious effort to source. So you really have to gather information and collect that information, and the information needs to be diverse. So one thing is you can source consumer trends. And obviously, if you know Lux, you know that our platform can help you do that. So our consumer insight services will help you source consumer trends. You also need to source technology trends. So solo flying, consumer trend, why biotech starting to become much more popular and much more innovative is a technology trend. And finally, and don't underestimate this, you have to crowdsource. And crowdsourcing really just means walk around in your ecosystem, listen, talk to people at conferences, feel the vibe. I know the vibe doesn't sound very scientific, but you can see what people are talking about. There are certain topics that are emerging that people suddenly all are talking about. And some of those are not that interesting. Sometimes it's blockchain that everyone thinks is going to change everything, and it turns out it has very specific applications where it can change a lot of things, but not everything. But crowdsourcing is really important, so make sure you pay attention to your senior people going to conferences, listening to things, your more experienced scientists. What are they hearing at conferences? Collect that information and store it. Make sure that all the information is gathered so everyone can look at the same picture. That will help you imagine what you need to look for. And then you start listening, right? So let's say you imagine that quantum technology is going to be really important. Again, that's not a very strange imagination to have these days. Then you may want to look at the European Quantum Computing Project as a weak signal, because it's real money being spent. There's real people paying attention, making an effort. And so this is a clear weak signal, which is real. It's a serious project. It's costly. Nobody will deny that this is costly. And it's resilient. It's not a blip. It stays. This goes on. This weak signal is not disappearing suddenly. People are really persisting in pursuing this idea. So now you've imagined, you've established a weak signal, and you say, this is a real trend. I can start to amplify. So you amplify, which means you start listing the consequences. Okay, so quantum technology becomes scalable and affordable. Aha, what does it mean? Well, there will be a high demand for superconducting materials, for example. It means that we need even more precise lithography than we have today. We need rare doping materials, maybe different rare doping materials than today. It probably also means that product development cycles will become faster. Why is that? Well, because quantum computing, for example, allows the formulation of chemicals, but also of food ingredients, to become really accelerated. Quantum computing is very well suited, for example, for defining chemical synthesis and complex chemical molecular shapes, if you think about catalysts, for example. So those consequences could be relatively straightforward. Superconducting materials, they could be quite intricate, faster product development cycles that is not directly obvious from this statement that quantum technology becomes scalable. But if you know a thing or two about quantum technology, you can infer that these things are also going to happen. So what's the business impact of that? And this is where you get to your company. Right? What's the business impact of this vision of the future? Well, manufacturing will become a limiting factor. If product innovation is going really fast because of quantum computing, you still need to make it, and manufacturing becomes the limiting factor. Versatile and flexible manufacturing is therefore required, right? And so there are opportunities for highly specialized materials if you are able to make them. So let's imagine you're a chemical company or you're a materials company. Then this might be your translation to the business impact of these consequences. And finally, now you need to define your positioning. And this is where you also start looking at near-term possibilities. So you say, okay, well, the new positioning must be, in this case, that I want to be good, even the best, at flexible, on-demand manufacturing of materials. So maybe not really a toll gate producer, but at least I want to be able to produce any materials that are in the future going to be invented through a quantum computing quickly. The turnaround from inventing a new material to delivering it should be as short as possible, and it should be as reliable as possible. And that means that you're going to focus your innovation today on process intensification and on developing highly versatile process equipment. Once you've defined that positioning, the next step is to see what is the low-hanging fruit. What can I do today that will be a near-term win already on process intensification? It could be new catalyst development. It could be development of microreactors that already help you produce certain products that you are interested in producing today. It could be developing better control algorithms. Anything that gets you along the way in that direction to create that new positioning will create your near-term wins. So looking back at what we've discussed, what we think, Naveen and I, are the key takeaways. There's a couple more takeaways you can have, and we're curious to hear something about that in your comments. And don't forget, you're able, I can see some questions rolling in, but don't forget your ability to ask questions. But the key takeaways for us is innovation is no longer serendipitous. So it's no longer just have a good R&D department and they will make amazing discoveries and that will be your innovation. You have to plan for it. You need to target it precisely. For chemicals and CPG, look at what part of your portfolio you want to focus. So you create critical mass, so you create an impact rather than disperse it across everything. For industrials, make choices and work on them with speed and accuracy. While you're planning, make sure you separate the why and the what, and separate planning and action. So take that process and stick to the process. Don't mix up the phases, because that will make it very hard for you to have a clear argument and a clear storyline about why you make certain choices. And those choices are important and need to be supported by your entire company, and possibly even by your entire ecosystem. And then finally, pertinent to today's webinar, find the positioning and use the weak signals methodology to do it. And the weak signals methodology requires you to also collect information systematically, just like you're collecting information systematically about your future markets. You also need to collect information about weak signals. With that, we'll leave you for today's webinar, and we're more than happy and actually quite curious as to any questions you may have. So, Naveen, do we have any questions yet?
No, thank you, Ari. This is great. We have some questions, but yes, please keep those questions coming. We'll take questions that you may have on this presentation. Please type them in the comments box. If we don't get to your question on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. Ari, let me start with this first question, which seems to be a summary and a question attached to it. So if you're in an industry segment that's much further upstream of trends and weak signals orchestrated by the end user, it sounds like as a leader, you have a choice to make. Wait for your immediate customer to tell you what they want from you, and then you perform R&D to develop a product or service that addresses that need, or you could monitor weak signals across the value chain and begin to develop scenarios, etc., before your own customers articulate that need to you. So here's the question. What do you say to those companies, Ari, that say there is no first mover advantage in their industry? So then why should those companies bother to monitor weak signals and be the first to act?
Right. Yeah, so I don't think weak signals are necessarily about gaining a first mover advantage. It can help you get a first mover advantage, obviously. This is why I suppose the question was asked. but it's not necessarily about that. What you want to do is you want to imagine where you want to end up as a company 4 or 5 years from now. So you want to really define your future position, and you want to align your current innovation efforts, assuming you have more choices than you can afford. Right? So you have more options to innovate than you have money. So you have to prioritize. How do you prioritize? By moving in the direction where you want to be in the future, in 5 years from now. That's positioning. That means that you need to look at changes that are so fundamental to your industry that you cannot even hope to be a second mover or a third mover, if you prefer that, if you start once the trend becomes obvious, once the first mover is already showing its first success. Right? When that happens, you'll be so far behind, you'll need years to catch up. You don't want to do that. What you want to do is you want to move in that direction in a way that is aligned with the choices you can make today to a positioning that will help you be, if not a first mover, at least a second or a third mover. Naveen, if you allow me, let me ask you a question, because you were talking about signal and signal noise ratio and all that. And I see a question coming in here about how do you look outside of your current business remit? So you've shown how the solo flyer trend, the solo flyer weak signal can affect many industries. But how do you get to those signals? If you're a if you're a composite manufacturer, how does it even occur to you to think about which people buy plane tickets and if there are any weak signals there?
Yeah, that's a fair question, Ari. But I think the key thing here is you got to maintain continual vigilance. But how do we do this in some structured fashion? You know, what you're seeking is just like you have an innovation funnel that is wide at the top and gets narrower as it progresses. What I think is needed is having a wide and wider weak signals funnel as we go forth. That weak signal funnel is going to have two components: machine intelligence and human intelligence. Machine intelligence is going to be data and analytics feeds that you already receive, and AI will help you crunch through all of that and give you some preliminary level of insights. But the second item, which is increasingly about human intelligence, is about building human relationships with those outside of your organization's fence. You know, our analysts are talking to our own sources every day. They're learning a lot. So you could start really thinking about how you extract not just data, but rather human intelligence from some of the more well-connected, cross-discipline sets of experts, like at Lux or elsewhere. That then allows you to find non-obvious interpretations to your hypothesis and expand your network beyond individuals with STEM background, science, technology, engineering, math. You know, when was the last time you talked to a social scientist about high-performance computing? One of our clients in consumer packaged goods was telling us last week how they would frequently use an internal expert with a theology degree to suss out connections that a consumer would unknowingly make when choosing a product in an entirely new category, like a new safety and hygiene product. If all of this sounds complicated, is there an easy entry point to monitor weak signals? At a minimum, what you want to do is to monitor known adjacencies to your existing customers' markets. You can progressively then start monitoring a broader span of customer markets. Remember, weak signals, not strong signals that are here and now. Weak signals will likely impact your customers and suppliers before they impact you. And ultimately, what are you trying to do? You're seeking to develop an underused muscle for sensing and interpreting things outside your fence. And at least for the foreseeable future, despite AI and everything, which are great tools, that skill, that muscle of sensing and interpreting is a human muscle. So I hope that answers it. I'll ask you another question, Ari. There's a few coming up. Companies have been looking at weak signals and conducting scenario planning exercises over a long period of time. why are we bringing up this topic now? Has anything changed recently in our conversations with our clients?
So I don't think anything has changed. I do think in many cases, people are still looking at this as a bit of black magic. Most successful companies have these gurus who seem to be really good at finding weak signals and interpreting them. And then if you ask one of those gurus how they do it, because they always seem to know about a new trend like 3 months before everyone else does. So how do you do that? And they hardly ever have an answer. And I think that is something that is changing right now. That's why we bring it up. There is a lot more thinking about weak signals, and we've been talking about weak signals for about the past 5 years with clients. And we've seen a great evolution in how to make this thinking more structured. And that's what we're sharing today. So that's one. And Naveen and I, we've been in projects with large national labs, for example, in the US, looking at weak signals. And we've seen great progress in how to do this in a more structural way. The second thing that's changing is AI. So not only have we and others been developing these more structured ways of dealing with and interpreting weak signals, we now also are getting the tool sets that make it much easier to find weak signals and to make those connections. And that's what large language models are doing for you. They can help you process large amounts of text and create connections in it, provided you're able to ask the right questions. So that imagine stage is still critical. Only if you are good at the imagine stage of the weak signals methodology, that's when you can get the right questions. But after that, finding the weak signals, listening, has just become much easier. Still not easy, but much easier than before through large language models.
That's excellent. Thanks, Ari. You know, I see quite a few other questions here. How do you separate signal from noise? How do you deal with contradictory weak signals? What do weak signals mean for our industry, etc.? Here's my suggestion, just in the interest of time. If the audience has more questions, why don't you email us at questions@Lux Research Inc. That's inc.com. And we'll get back to you. Talk to us if you want to learn more about how you track, identify, then track, and then interpret weak signals and build scenarios. But this concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all the attendees via email. After leaving this webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We would appreciate any feedback you may have to help improve and inform and improve our future webinars. And take a moment to check out our upcoming webinars. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.